the idea of the deserving versus the undeserving poor is obviously rather topical at the moment. I think, just to give it a bit of context, until about the 1350s, basically a lot of things happen in the mid-14th century, which I'll explain in a minute, but until about then, you hardly get this idea that people are undeserving. People tend to be given the benefit of doubt, and most commentators, most people who left us records in the Middle Ages, up to about 1350, tend to assume that if someone is needy, somebody needs something, then they deserve to be aided. And again, this ties in with the Church's notion of charity and the idea that if you help someone with a charitable deed, then it's almost like you're buying yourself a little bit closer into heaven. Now, what changes about 1350? You basically have the first half of the 14th century. We've got about 50 years of literally one bad thing after another. It seems that there was a change in climate. Summers were getting wetter and cooler, winters quite wet, so that had a knock-on effect. You had bad harvests, and you had some particularly bad harvests around 1316, 17, so there was massive famine, lots of people dying. Then just as you think that recovers, in the 1320s, so less than 10 years later, you get cattle diseases. That's important because people need cattle for traction. If you don't have oxen to pull the plough, you can't plough your fields, so you can't produce the next harvest, so it's literally knock-on effect. And then of course you get the Black Death, what you've heard of in your school history. So you've had about 3 decades of literally one event after the other. And for England and France, of course, in the 1330s, what later becomes known as the 100 Years' War starts. So on top of all these natural disasters, you might say, you've got a man-made disaster of the war. Now, what all this boils down to is that the economic situation is pretty grim after the mid-14th century. There are less people around because of the great mortality during the plague, during the Black Death. The harvests had failed. There are not the same numbers of people to do all the agricultural work. It's pretty catastrophic, and there's a strong feeling that everything's going down the pan. It's almost like the end of civilization. Now with that goes the idea, all hands on deck. So anyone who can work is drafted into work. Because you've got the labour shortage, there's this idea everybody who can must pull their weight and must work. So that's where you start getting ideas coming in about, in modern words, malingerers, scroungers, lazy, idle people who just don't want to work. And this is where you then get the notion between the deserving and the undeserving poor. So you get a whole literature about people who are deserving and who should still be the recipients of charity. And then on the other hand, you get these stereotypes of the sturdy beggar. That's a phrase that comes up quite often. So the sturdy beggar is the person who's begging even though apparently they have no need to. And sturdy is the word used to describe them as non-disabled, physically non-disabled. Sturdy beggars shouldn't beg because they can go and get a job, get a job, earn your living, and don't be a burden. There's no welfare state, but don't be a burden on individual charity. And again, the literature of the period talks about people pretending to be deserving poor because they're so lazy and so idle. They are really sturdy beggars, but they make out to be deserving poor. Now, who are deserving poor? Anyone that the Middle Ages regarded as incapable of work, incapable of earning a living. So that includes many people with disabilities, so people who are orthopaedically impaired, visually impaired, they're referred to in the sources as the blind or the crippled, not words we'd use nowadays, but that's how they're described. But also women with small children are regarded as deserving poor, widows, but not widowers, and orphans. So these, the widows, the orphans, and the disabled people, there you might say the classic group of deserving poor. Now what happens as part of this narrative, as part of these stories about the undeserving, you get tales told about fraudulent beggars. So there's a whole, I mean this is a literature that you get in England in the late 14th century. People like Langland, who wrote a poem called Piers Plowman, and Chaucer, they mention some of this, and also on the continent, in Germany, in Italy, in France, you get stories about people who are faking disabilities. So able-bodied people deliberately pretending to be disabled so that they don't have to go and work and they get a place amongst the so-called deserving poor. And I want to show a picture here to kind of highlight this stereotype and we might even say the popular anxiety about fraudulent begging at the time. This is part of a panel, so it's one side of a larger painting. It would get folded shut around an altarpiece, and it's by someone called Hieronymus Bosch, painted in the, he was a Flemish, a Netherlandish painter, and this is just before 1500s, or late 1490s, and it shows Saint Bavo. Bavo was the patron saint of Ghent in what's now Belgium, and Saint Bavo is digging into his pocket, ready to give money to the deserving poor. His hand is in his wallet and he's facing this group of people here, and I'll just describe them from top to bottom. You can see a tiny little head, that's a baby, an infant, so a young child, definitely deserving, an elderly woman, that will be the widow, and then a small person, I would say that's a child in badly fitting clothing, so that might be the orphan who's been given hand-me-down clothing. So you've got your classic deserving poor on that side. But here, on the side facing away from St Bavo, and in the background, is, I'd say, a prime example of one of the fraudulent beggars. You've got a person with a kind of twisted or withered arm sitting on the ground, and he's placed a napkin or some sort of white cloth in front of him, and on that is a foot, a hacked off foot. Now this raises all kinds of questions. Is this his own foot? Is this a person who's actually able-bodied, who's acquired a foot, let's not ask how, somehow, and is displaying that, pretending it's his own foot? If it is his own foot, is he a criminal who suffered a mutilating punishment? Is he someone who had an illness or an accident and therefore is reduced to beggary, and to try and to get people to feel sorry for him, he's displaying his foot? So I don't want to belabour this point because for modern sensitivities it's quite gruesome, but this is a very disturbing image and it raises all sorts of questions that I'm certain people around 1500 would have asked as well. So to me, this image sums up the ambiguity of somebody who is or is not disabled. This image questions the status of disabled that the person there cowering in the background has, and it certainly casts doubt on the status of being deserving. So the idea that people are not deserving and that they're trying to get something for nothing, which is a rhetoric that we're hearing unfortunately far too often in the last 2 years or so, is something that seems to have its origins in the later 14th century.